Sometimes you find yourself in a situation where you just know how it's going to end, but you still have to live through every step of the unraveling. This is one of those stories. Our firm, a mid-sized consulting company in Denver, had always been pretty stable. Good culture, decent management. The kind of place where people actually stuck around for years. HR was just HR. If you had an issue, you reported it, both sides got heard, evidence was considered, and the outcome generally made sense. It wasn't revolutionary, just fair. That was until Sarah arrived. She was hired as our new HR director about 18 months ago, and she came in with this really strong sense of mission. Within her first couple of weeks, I remember hearing her tell people in casual conversations that our existing culture was built on the wrong priorities, that traditional HR was fundamentally flawed. A guy from operations laughed it off, said she was just settling in. Most of us did. Before I get into what happened, let me just say a little about myself, because it's important context. I'm Michael, a senior engineer. And in engineering, being direct isn't a choice, it's a necessity. If there's a flaw in a design, you name it, explain why it's a flaw, and propose a fix. Vagueness gets people hurt, or at least costs a lot of money. So in meetings, I'm thorough. I push back, but it's always about the work, never personal. I had 2 junior engineers under me, and I gave them honest, consistent feedback. For years with the company, clean record, solid reviews, never a whisper of HR involvement. About 6 weeks after Sarah started, she called a mandatory all-hands meeting. She had this whole presentation ready, slides, case studies, the works. She walked us through what she called the Workplace Safety and Equity Protocol. The centerpiece was a system she'd designed herself, the Trauma-Informed Response System for complaints. Here's how it worked. Anyone could submit a complaint about anyone else through a new digital portal. Completely anonymous. The person filing the complaint would never be revealed, at any stage. No witnesses required, no evidence required, no need to confront the accused. The investigation, Sarah explained, would focus on impact over intent. Meaning, it didn't matter what you meant when you said or did something. If your behavior made anyone feel uncomfortable or unsafe, that was enough for corrective action. Oh, and she added an automatic temporary suspension for serious allegations. If a report was serious enough, the accused would be suspended while the review happened, with zero access to the specific allegations and no idea who filed the complaint. During the Q&A, I raised my hand. I asked what protections existed against false accusations, specifically if there was any mechanism to verify a complaint was made in good faith before taking serious action. I thought it was a pretty reasonable question. Sarah looked at me, standing there in front of about 180 people, and said it was very telling that my first concern was false accusations rather than creating a safe environment. I calmly responded that those weren't mutually exclusive concerns. She just moved on. David from sales asked about an appeals process. Sarah told him that question was essentially asking how accused employees could escape accountability. Again, she just moved on. Someone else asked about evidence requirements. Sarah explained that requiring evidence created an impossible burden for victims since most discrimination happens without witnesses. The meeting ended. I walked back to my desk, my mind racing. 1. This system is going to be abused. 2. She just publicly shamed 3 people for asking perfectly valid questions. And 3. I probably just painted a target on my own back. I was right about all 3. The new portal launched the next week. For the first 2 weeks, it was mostly minor stuff, a vague complaint about the break room atmosphere, someone interrupting in meetings, no names attached. Sarah sent out company-wide emails, gentle reminders to communicate professionally. Annoying, but harmless. Then Mark from accounting got suspended. Mark had been with the company for 8 years. Clean record, solid performance, the kind of guy who knew where every archived project file was buried. Never a complaint. He wasn't loud or aggressive, he just quietly did his job. An anonymous complaint had alleged that Mark made uncomfortable personal comments to a female colleague and that she felt unsafe being alone with him. Sarah called Mark in, told him he was on temporary suspension. He asked to see the specific allegations. No. He asked who filed it. No. He asked what he was supposed to do to address a concern he wasn't allowed to see. He was told the process would be thorough and fair, and he should go home. Mark sat on suspension for a week. Sarah's investigation, as I later found out through an external review, consisted of her interviewing Mark's female colleagues. Most described him as professional and pleasant. A couple said they barely knew him. Sarah reviewed his email history. Nothing. Checked building access logs. Nothing unusual. The evidence tally was 0. Her conclusion? Absence of evidence doesn't mean absence of wrongdoing. Harassment victims, she reasoned, often have valid reasons for not providing detailed proof. She transferred Mark to a different department, adding a formal coaching requirement to his file. And get this, she documented his reluctant acceptance of the transfer as an additional concerning behavioral pattern. Let that sink in. A man with 8 years of spotless service moved out of his department over an unspecified allegation with no evidence. And when he was understandably shaken by it, his reaction became a warning sign. The rest of us watched this happen, processing it in quiet conversations, raised eyebrows. Most people told themselves it was an isolated incident, an overreaction that wouldn't repeat. We were wrong. This is the entire problem with a system that removes the ability to challenge an accusation. Mark couldn't see the allegation, couldn't respond to specifics, couldn't provide context. And when he tried to understand, it was flagged as suspicious. There was literally no path to clearing his name. The system wasn't built to find the truth, it was built so the accuser was always correct by default. His confusion became evidence against him. About 8 weeks after the system launched, Sarah called me in. An anonymous complaint. She wouldn't let me read it, just summarized. I used overly complex technical explanations in meetings, making female colleagues feel excluded and intellectually intimidated. I asked for specific examples. Which meeting? Which explanation? Which person? Anything concrete I could work with. She told me the specific details mattered less than the impact I was having. I tried to explain that technical accuracy in engineering isn't negotiable. When I'm walking a team through a load analysis or equipment spec, I use precise language because imprecise language causes expensive mistakes. If the expectation was for me to simplify to the point of inaccuracy, I needed to understand that explicitly. She said that kind of defensive response was exactly the concern she was hearing about. I recognized what was happening. If I said nothing, it was guilt. If I explained, the explanation itself became the problem. There was no valid move. I left with a mandatory sensitivity training requirement on my file. That evening, I started a personal documentation log. Nothing dramatic, just a running record of every meeting, every interaction, who was present, what was discussed, what I said, the context. On my personal device, not the company system. Nobody knew about it. 3 weeks later, I was called in again. Second report. This time, the allegation was that I'd made disparaging comments about the company's diversity initiatives and that my attitude made a female colleague feel attacked for being a woman in engineering. Here's what I knew. I'd had a private conversation with 2 coworkers, not public, not email, nothing documented, where I'd said the anonymous reporting system seemed to be generating more workplace anxiety than it was resolving. That private conversation had, apparently, made its way into the system. Sarah told me she was deeply concerned about my resistance to equity initiatives. I pointed out I hadn't made any public statements. She said claiming confusion was a common avoidance tactic. She put me on a formal performance improvement plan. Weekly check-ins, additional training, specific behavioral expectations. She noted in my file that my continued resistance was an escalating concern and that further incidents could result in termination. I sat across from her and said nothing beyond what was absolutely necessary. Not because I lacked things to say, believe me, I had a lot, but because I'd figured out that every word I offered in that room would be documented as defensiveness, which would then become evidence in the next round. So, I kept quiet, agreed to the requirements on record, and left. Then I went home and updated my documentation log with a detailed account of both sessions, including Sarah's exact phrasing and justifications. My log was already 40 pages. Most people in my situation would have fired off an angry email, gone straight to the CEO, or started venting to everyone. All completely understandable reactions. And all of them would have handed Sarah exactly what her system needed, emotional reactions she could document as further evidence. I just went home and quietly wrote everything down. Every date, every word she said, every context she dismissed. While she was building her case in her system, I was building a factual record of reality. That documentation was going to be more important than anything else. When you're dealing with a system where subjective impressions count as evidence, an objective paper trail is your only real counter. That's playing the long game. The same week I received my PIP, David from the sales team was suspended. David was the kind of employee who made friends easily, high energy, always organizing team lunches, remembered everyone's preferences. 5 years, solid numbers, no prior issues. An anonymous report alleged that David had made inappropriate advances toward a female colleague at a company team lunch. The complaint described uncomfortable personal questions, unwanted physical contact, and using his position to create pressure. David was suspended and denied everything. He asked to face his accuser or at least understand the specific incident. Sarah told him demanding to confront his accuser was itself an intimidation tactic and documented his aggressive reaction as further concerning behavior. The investigation involved Sarah interviewing other women who attended the lunch. Most hadn't witnessed anything. A few noted David could be enthusiastic and ask personal questions, and that he sometimes gave more attention to younger female colleagues. Sarah pulled expense records and noted David had picked up the tab for female colleagues at several past lunches. Based on that, second-hand characterizations from people who hadn't witnessed the alleged incident, plus expense records showing he'd occasionally paid for meals, Sarah recommended termination for a pattern of boundary violations. Robert, our CEO, pushed back. He said the evidence seemed circumstantial and firing someone without clearer documentation created legal exposure. Sarah told him that waiting for a more serious incident was a failure of the company's responsibility and reminded him of the legal risks of ignoring harassment complaints. Robert, clearly calculating liability from both directions, signed off. David was fired. The effect on the office was fast and visible. Within 2 weeks, I noticed men declining casual coffee invitations from female colleagues. The informal interactions that were once normal. Guys were canceling project check-ins that weren't strictly mandatory. The easy back and forth that makes a workplace actually function was disappearing because people were genuinely afraid of where any informal conversation might end up. Women started noticing and complaining. One of the women on the development team said, and I remember this clearly, that the men were treating them like they'd file a complaint if someone disagreed with them. She said it with frustration, not satisfaction. She wasn't wrong. But men weren't behaving that way out of disrespect, they were doing it because the system had made normal workplace interaction feel like an incalculable risk. Productivity dropped noticeably. Projects fell behind. Clients started raising concerns. Robert called Sarah in and told her the policies might be creating unintended consequences. Sarah told him that resistance was normal when you challenged entrenched power structures, and temporary disruption was the expected cost of real cultural change. She persuaded him to give the system more time. For people disciplined, transferred, or fired. Mark lost his department over nothing. David lost his job over a lunch and an expense report. I had a PIP for explaining engineering concepts and a private conversation. And every time someone raised a concern, Sarah's Answer was the same, that's just what resistance to change looks like. That framing was a trap. Because if all pushback is automatically resistance, the system can never be questioned. It can only grow. And systems that can't be questioned always, eventually, turn on the people running them. She was about to find that out personally. By week 12, anonymous reports were coming in almost daily: microaggression complaints, exclusionary atmosphere, dismissive communication. Most with no names, no incidents. Sarah was running group coaching sessions and issuing company-wide reminders weekly. Then she received a report about Robert. An anonymous complainant alleged that Robert had made dismissive comments during an executive meeting about the company's diversity initiatives and questioned the leadership capabilities of women. The complainant cited the obvious power imbalance as the reason they couldn't come forward directly. Sarah took this to Karen, the board member who was her main contact for HR matters, and pushed for an external investigation of the CEO. Karen was skeptical. An anonymous allegation with no corroborating evidence against the chief executive was not, she pointed out, a standard basis for a formal investigation. Sarah told her that requiring evidence was exactly the kind of institutional thinking that protected powerful men. Karen authorized a limited external investigation. The investigator reviewed meeting recordings, interviewed female executives, and identified what the report characterized as a pattern of microaggressions, instances where Robert had interrupted speakers or expressed skepticism about presentations in ways that could be read as dismissive. Nothing explicitly inappropriate, nothing that approached harassment under any established legal standard, but enough within the framework Sarah had built to warrant corrective action. The board required Robert to attend executive coaching and submit to an oversight committee monitoring his interactions with female staff. He complied without public objection. I think this was the moment the board started watching Sarah's process much more carefully. They'd just been maneuvered into applying her system to the CEO, the same system that had fired David and transferred Mark, and some of them were starting to ask what the actual evidentiary standard had been in any of those cases. If the answer was the same for all of them, that was a problem. Week 16, a Friday. An anonymous report came in through the portal targeting Sarah directly. The complaint described a pattern of hostile behavior and abuse of authority. It alleged that Sarah had publicly humiliated employees during training sessions, created an intimidating environment for anyone who questioned her policies, and retaliated against staff who raised procedural concerns. It referenced specific incidents, the all-hands meeting where she dismissed questions from me, David, and others. The coaching sessions where she documented employees' explanations as defensiveness. The transfer note on Mark's file characterizing his reaction as a warning sign. Sarah's immediate response was to call it a coordinated bad faith attack by people trying to undo her equity work. She went to Karen and said the complaint was obvious retaliation and should be dismissed. Karen told her the complaint would be handled according to the same procedures as every other complaint the company had received. Sarah said these allegations were different. Karen asked her to explain how, specifically, she would distinguish this complaint from any of the others. She also reminded Sarah that Sarah herself had stated during policy implementation that complainants couldn't be dismissed based on suspected motives. Sarah didn't have an answer. The external investigator came in and spent 2 weeks interviewing people. Mark gave his account, unable to see the allegation, told his questions were suspicious, his confusion documented as a red flag. David described the investigation, how his request to understand the allegations had been characterized as intimidation. I sat down with the investigator and walked through my full documentation log, 160 pages covering 14 months of meetings, coaching, interactions, all time-stamped and noted with context. Chris from IT, who'd been coached for offering help to colleagues and told his attempts to be useful were perpetuating harmful biases, described reaching a point where he didn't feel safe engaging with female coworkers in any informal capacity. The women who'd supported Sarah's policies also gave testimony, some genuinely believed the system had improved their experience. The investigator noted that perspective too, without dismissing it. What the investigator found across all of it was a documented and consistent pattern of Sarah publicly questioning the motives of employees who raised procedural concerns rather than engaging with the substance. Multiple instances of attributing objections to bias rather than considering them on their merits. A PIP applied to me based on 2 anonymous complaints with no corroborating evidence. A termination, David's, recommended on what the investigator's report described as an insufficient evidentiary foundation. The investigator recommended a comprehensive overhaul of investigation procedures, inclusion of basic due process protections, and Sarah's removal from the HR oversight role pending a full misconduct investigation of her own conduct. During the period between the investigator's preliminary findings and the board's decision, 3 more anonymous reports came in about Sarah. All followed a similar pattern: fear of career retaliation, intimidating management style, feeling unable to challenge her authority. Sarah read each one and recognized the structure immediately. She'd processed the same kind of reports herself for months. Now she was on the other side of it. Anonymous allegation, no access to the specific claim, no ability to identify the complainant, no direct channel to respond. The exact same process she'd given Mark, and David, and me. She went to the board and requested modifications. She wanted corroborating evidence required before serious action. She wanted access to the specific allegations so she could respond with context. Karen directed her to the documented record of every time she denied those exact same requests to other employees and the reasoning Sarah had provided for each denial. The room was quiet for a while. This was the moment. Sarah told Mark his questions were suspicious. She told David that wanting to face his accuser was intimidation. She told me my explanations were a defensive pattern that validated the concern. She designed the system specifically so the accused couldn't push back. And now she was sitting across from a board member, asking for every single one of those things: evidence standards, specific allegations, a chance to respond with context. She experienced in about 4 weeks what she'd put other people through for months. There's no denying the satisfaction in that. But more than that, it's just the outcome of building a system with no accountability. Eventually, something unaccountable turns on you. She built it. She ran it. She found out. The board voted to implement the investigator's full set of recommendations. Sarah was placed on administrative leave while the misconduct investigation concluded. It ran 3 weeks. The final report found that her management approach had created a hostile work environment within the HR function and had extended into her handling of company-wide complaints. Specific findings included a documented pattern of intimidating behavior toward employees who raised procedural concerns, multiple instances of retaliation against staff for questioning the investigation process, and an abuse of administrative authority across several cases she'd managed. The board accepted the termination recommendation. Sarah's employment ended immediately. A new interim HR director came in and began a systematic review of every disciplinary action taken during Sarah's tenure. Mark was reinstated to his original position in accounting with full back pay and a formal written apology from the company, acknowledging that his transfer had been conducted without adequate evidentiary basis. 8 years of clean service. He handled the whole thing with more composure than most people would have managed. David's termination was overturned. The company reached a legal settlement for wrongful dismissal, substantial from what I heard, though the exact number wasn't public. He came back to the sales floor and, by all accounts, had a very productive year. Chris from IT received a formal acknowledgement that his coaching requirements had been implemented without justification. He actually leads a workplace communication training program now, which is a considerably better outcome than that situation ever deserved. Robert's executive oversight requirements were reviewed and substantially reduced after the board concluded that the original investigation supporting them had lacked a sufficient evidentiary basis. And then there was my situation. I had 160 pages of personal documentation. Every meeting I'd attended for 14 months, dates, attendees, topics, my exact contributions, the full context around every technical explanation that had supposedly been problematic. Full notes from both coaching sessions and every weekly PIP check-in, written up within an hour of each one ending. A clear paper trail showing that both reports against me lacked any corroborating evidence, that my conduct during documented meetings was consistent with standard engineering communication, and that the characterization of my explanations as intimidation had no factual basis. The promotion I'd been waiting on had been stalled throughout the investigation. 3 months after the review concluded, it went through Senior Engineering Lead. I also received written acknowledgement that both complaints against me had been found to lack evidentiary support and that no record of either coaching session or the PIP would remain in my personnel file. The new HR procedures that replaced Sarah's system built in actual due process on both sides. Anonymous reporting remained available as an option, but serious disciplinary action now required corroborating evidence. Accused employees had the right to understand the substance of the allegations against them and respond with context. Investigations had to function for both parties. Workplace climate surveys 6 months later showed significant improvement in reported trust and communication. Men and women were working together again, the way a functional workplace requires, because the fear of invisible and untouchable accusations had been removed from the environment. About a year out from all this, I ran into Mark in the hallway outside a project review. He'd been back in his department for months, same role, same desk, the same reliable presence he'd always been. We talked briefly about a project we were both tangentially involved with. Neither of us brought up the transfer or the investigation or any of it. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said in official documents. A few things I'd put out there for anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation, because this kind of thing doesn't only happen in one company. First, document everything, and start before you think you need to. My log started the evening of my first coaching session, when something in my gut told me this wasn't going to be a one-time thing. By the time the external investigator sat down with me, I had more factual documentation of my own conduct than the HR department had of anything they'd done to me. That record was the difference between walking out with a promotion and walking out with nothing. Second, don't give the system your emotional reaction. I know how hard that is. Watching Mark get transferred for nothing, watching David get fired over a lunch, sitting through sessions where Sarah told me that explaining my own job was a form of intimidation, all of it was genuinely infuriating in a way I wasn't always able to shut off at home. But in a system where emotional responses count as evidence of guilt, staying calm isn't just the emotionally healthy move, it's the strategically essential one. The calmer I stayed, the less material she had to build a case with. Sarah needed an angry, reactive Michael. I didn't give her one. The last thing, fairness matters on both sides of a complaint. Always. I want to be clear that I'm not saying workplace harassment isn't real or serious. It absolutely is. What Sarah built wasn't a system to address it properly. It was a system that stripped out every mechanism designed to find the truth and replaced those mechanisms with an assumption that the complaint was automatically valid. That's not protection. That's just power with no accountability. The version of the policies that replaced hers does both things at once. It makes it easier for people to come forward, and it gives the accused a functioning process. Both of those things can exist at the same time. They have to. So, what's the most unhinged workplace policy you've ever had to deal with?